Hey, what's up, dude? It's me, Mr. Airon here, the cool dude here. Welcome back to another video. So today, in the second channel, in this video, I might be doing something a little bit different here. But so today, I'm gonna be doing also kind of like a historical analysis of this one video game that everybody has been playing on Roblox. It's just a zombie game that takes place in the Napoleonic Wars, which is called Guts and Blackpowder, and which is a zombie shooter game, like where you basically hold off basically the hordes of the different zombie apocalypse during the area of the Napoleonic Wars here. So, if you guys, but I haven't made a YouTube video yet in my first channel of playing the game here, but I might maybe do plan that as like maybe a future video on my first channel. And so yeah, so before we so I'll be going through. So yeah, what I'm basically gonna do in this video is cover like basically the historical analysis of like the whole Guts and Black Powder, like the all of the pretty much like all the maps and like the probably the and also the small details like the weapons and like the US ship battleship or like the battleships that were used in throughout the game here. So to those who don't know what the Guts and Black Powder game is, it's basically like a Roblox video game that takes place in the Napoleonic Wars. But like it takes place, I heard the backstory is basically pretty much the same. Like basically like during our times when we're talking about the French Revolution or the Napoleonic Wars, and it was during around like in 1812 that Napoleon had basically invaded Russia and like basically to enforce the Russians back into the continental system. But when he barely like makes it into Russia, then something bad happened. Like basically when the disease called the blight here, and that the dead comes from the rises and basically started the blight infection here. But that's part of the story is basically part fiction here because like the Napoleon's invasion of Russia was then like basically actually launched basically it comes from through troops from the Duchy of Warsaw, from the 3rd and the 5th regiments, and led by Murat and like we say Napoleon and Dutoit, who commanded also and launched the invasion of Napoleon, and many of the Russian generals to defend off, and basically the general that basically came up with a tactic that this time to just like basically go retreating here while Napoleon's troops are basically marching here. That was later bit by and Pokrodorczycki, where they basically had decisive attacks, and that way Napoleon's troops had then basically invaded, and like basically after many major missive battles that fought between the French and the Russians, such as Smolensk here, and that the which capitulated, and where the Russian and the French had basically burned down many of the towns here, and like they and where it's a few thousand casualties were fought by both sides, as well as in the fearsome battle of Borodino here, and that's where the Russians were ultimately retreated and like basically fought fierce French fighters, and like you see with cannon shots and everything, and until when the French had also marched all the way to Moscow here, and when they arrived, they saw that they sounded the city completely abandoned here, and that's why the Russians had burned it down. That fears the Russians would not surrender, and that the French had to retreat. But then the Russian winter had came in, and the French forces had to retreat through the harsh winters. Like there were no foods or like basically any supplies here, and plus, the French also had to make across a bridge also through the Berezina River here, which I'll be getting to later in this video. And yeah, but then the French had basically had to retreat it all the way back, and thus then like the Russians and then all the other coalition allies of Austria, Prussia, Britain, and then you had the Italian states here, and later the Kingdom of Bavaria then sided with the Allied forces here, and like basically they then fought against Napoleon then later in the battles of Leipzig here, where it was fought between the coalition allies, what took place on October 16th to 19th of 1813, where like you see like Blucher's forces and like Prussian forces all the way to the north of the city, and like basically Stauffenberg and the Austrian forces from the south, and like you see other allied coalitions here in the south, and while the French were basically trying to gain all their supply lines and everything and the troops, and that was humiliated by many of the generals such as Murat here, and until they were then clashed by different cannon fires over the days until through day and night here, and until then until the ninth, that's where the generals then the Kalish and allies then brought into a full charge here and asked them to fear some battle here and capitulated and with deaths and casualties on both sides. The French had to be basically retreated into the supply box before the bridge that was connected from Leipzig had been already destroyed here, and that's why they lost their supplies. Thus, Napoleon had to be exiled back into to Elba here, and but then he basically but that way the French king, basically Louis the 18th, had came along and basically did reforms of basically of the whole kingdom, reforms like paying taxes and reforming lowering the army and basically and did enough food for basically the ideas that were praising from the French Revolution here, and they say, but Napoleon had then escaped and then basically went back to France, where he was stopped by the Marshal Ney and the French troops of the 5th Regiment here. But then Napoleon had then basically the troops refused to fire at Napoleon, and that they recognized their own emperor, and they brought him back to power. Not before Napoleon was then defeated by the Duke of Wellington under the British Army and General Blücher later into the Battle of Waterloo, until he was then exiled into St. Helena, and until then he was then exiled and then he was stayed and remained there until his death in May 5th of 1821, most likely due to stomach cancer. So yeah, that's the whole history behind the whole the Guns and Black Eyes. But we're gonna be going through all the maps here, so let's get to it. All right, so now let's get to the first map. So we have the Vardus Fortress, which is its early fortifications was the earliest fortification in Vardu. Was erected around the 1300 by King Hakon the Fifth of Magnusson, who asserted the Norwegian sovereignty and secured tax revenues from the Finnmark region. The border disputes and conflicts were that the fortress had been built in response to the conflicts between Norway and the Republic of Novgorod, which was at the time was stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains. In the 14th century structures, while the earliest fortresses were not well preserved, a structure with the presence of the early 14th century, with the records of mentioning the Archbishop of the Trondheim visiting the consecrate of the new Vardu Church in 1307. And the star-shaped design, the current star-shaped design was completed between 1734 and 1738, reflecting the contemporary European military architecture that its bastion type system. And after the Second World War, the fortress was briefly used as a prison before returning its fortress status. And so then we have the Battle of Leipzig here, which the Battle of Leipzig was known as the Battle of the Nations, was a major in the Napoleonic Wars, which was fought between in the years in October 16th to the 19th of 1813 near Leipzig, Germany, which is the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, involving 500,000 soldiers in multiple nations. The battle resulted in a decisive defeat for Napoleon and his French army, marking the turning point for the War of the Sixth Coalition here, and that I mentioned before. So let's keep going. And then we have the other maps in the game, such as the Catacombs de Paris, which the Catacombs de Paris began as a limestone quarries back in the Roman era, that's where you see all the Roman structures here a bit here, and that was then repurposed in the late 18th century to address the city's overflowing cemeteries, overcrowding the unsanitary conditions in the Parisian graveyards, particularly in the Cemetery des Innocents, and to the transfer of the remains of the underground quarries. This process, starting in 1785, involved the nightly transfer of the bones of various cemeteries, and resulted in the Paris Municipal Ossuary, and known as the Catacombs. And the Catacombs involved in a particular solution to the public health crisis that created a historically significant site, eventually opening to the public in 1809. And then we have the siege of San Sebastian in 1813, which is the siege of San Sebastian from 1813 was a significant event and was part of the Peninsula War between marking the turning point in the Duke of Wellington's campaign against Napoleon's forces. While the initial assault failed, the ultimate capture of the city, despite its heavy destruction and high casualties, allowed Wellington to further advance into the France and contributed to the weakening of the French forces in the region here. And that way, that access into like basically the English, also to the French and English borders too. All right, and then we have Kalb from 1813 to 1814. That Kalb's history is deeply intertwined. Its strategic location on the Rhine River and its association of fortifications, first mentioned in 983, it became a significant town due to its stolen station of the Pfalzgrafenstein Castle, and it has a major role in the military history, particularly in Blucher's crossing from 1813 to 1814, and the town was boosted, and the town itself was also boosted. It's the Gutenfalls castle as well, preserved at the town hall. And then we have the map of Copenhagen, which Copenhagen faced many challenges such as the fires and bombardments during the Napoleonic Wars. However, it also experienced periods of cultural and economic growth, becoming a center for the arts, science, and intellectual discourses. In 1801 and 1807, the British bombarded Copenhagen because they had concerns of like basically that the Danish might supply Napoleon and basically the French army, and so that's why they bombarded the city twice. And then we have the Battle of Waterloo. Part of it is with Hougoumont, which the defense of Hougoumont was a fortified farm complex. It was a crucial part of the Battle of Waterloo. And while it was initially intended as a diversionary attack by Napoleon, it became a prolonged and bloody battle and significantly impacted the overall outcome. The tensions, like defenses of the British and the Allied troops, particularly the Coldstream Guards, tied to large down the French troops and resources, preventing from effectively attacking Wellington's main line on the ridge. And the fierce fighting at Hougoumont was, including the very famous closing of the gates, became a symbol of the British resilience and contributed to Wellington's eventual victory. And that's why the French could not basically break through the fortifications and to capture Hougoumont. And then also alongside with Hougoumont, a few miles away, and like basically after the British launched the Scots Great Charge here, which were pounded by the French cannon fire and the fierce fighting, and Marshal May's charge was also through the historical site of La Haye-Sainte, which La Haye-Sainte was a crucial and heavily contested farmhouse complex during the Battle of Waterloo, which is a strategic location and strong defense significantly impacted the battle's progression and outcome. And the farm's defenders, primarily the King's German Legion, were held out against the repeated French attacks and delaying Napoleon's advance and allowing Wellington to reinforce his lines. If Napoleon had captured La Haye-Sainte earlier, his forces might have been broken through the Allied center and potentially won the battle. But like basically, the French had eventually also basically had like, but that's like the fierce fighting with the British created from all sides there, that the French were able to get recapture of La Haye-Sainte here, but not before the first British line instead of fighting back here until they after the Marshalese trap into like basically every charge here that fraud like basically many British square fighting fortifications or circle square defenses that like basically Blucher and the Prussians had arrived here, and they helped and supplied with the side with the Duke of Wellington, and basically then defeated Napoleon here. And after 150 casualties on both sides, the Battle of Waterloo was basically over. All right. And now we have the also alongside with the Battle of Waterloo, we have the Ferme d'Enhout, which is also part of the battle with the Battle of Ligny in 1815, which is the Battle of Ligny, which is under the French troops of the Armée du Nord and under the command of Napoleon, defeated the part of the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher, which was fought between on June 16th of 1815 near Ligny, what is now Belgium. Was the last of Napoleon's victory that took place near the village of Ligny that was in Belgium. I might have said that twice, my bad. Despite winning the tactical victory, Napoleon had failed to destroy the Prussian army, which is later played later in the Battle of Waterloo. Alright, then you have the Roscoff map, which is in the game that founded in the 16th century. That was initially served as the outer harbor before developing into a distinct town known for its granite houses built for its wealthy merchants. The town's association with the sea led to the development of a center therapy in the late 19th century, leveraging the benefits of the seawater and seaweed. Roscoff's story also includes the famous pink onions, which are famously exported by the Burton traders known as the Johnnies to England. So that's basically the history that I can research. I could not find like any evidence to basically that supports that there are basically because there was no like basically any battle that has been actually fought in the Battle of Roscoff that was actually during the Napoleonic Wars. So we couldn't find it, and we could not find any evidence also in this map of like the USS Constitution that were arrived in Roscoff, nor did like Crawford basically like which I'll get to also these parts later, received like intercepted message to France in Roscoff. All right, so let's go to the Battle of Berezina, which I mentioned. The Battle of Berezina, which is fought on November of 1812, which is a significant event in Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia. While Napoleon managed to get remnants of his Grande Armée across the Berezina River, and like basically, you see the image building the bridge, the battle resulted in a massive casualties and further crippled his forces, becoming the symbol of the campaign's overall failure. The term Berezina even entered into the French language as a synonym for disaster. And like basically that's where the French had starved and like basically cold water, and that they running out of supplies there, that they had to build a bridge for their retreat because that they fought and like basically a harsh and cold winter, and then cannot entirely invade Russia, and that they were they're capitulated by the Russian army. So let's get to more. Alright, so then we have Tyrolean Village. If you guys know in Guts and Blackpowder, it was like one of the endless maps. It was during like Napoleonic Wars in the Tyrol region, including what is now Tyrolean Village, experienced a significant upheaval, which initially it was part of the Habsburg Empire of Austria. Tyrol was then seceded by Bavaria, who was at the time allied with Napoleon in 1805, and to the Tyrol, which led to the Tyrolean Uprising in 1809, fueled to the resentment towards the Bavarian rule and desire to maintain the traditional freedoms and Catholic identity. The rebellion led by figures like Andreas Hofer, who saw several battles against Bavarian and French forces, which while initially successful, the rebellion was eventually suppressed and the Tyrol remained under Bavarian control until after Napoleon's defeat. Alright. And then we have the map of St. Petersburg. So St. Petersburg was a rich history which had like basically which was initially founded by Peter the Great in 1703, which a new capital for Russia, and like which was served as a capital, like basically they served as like the capital of St. Petersburg after like when the Russians had basically defeated the Swedish in the Great Northern War, and there was also the time that Russia was then basically proclaimed as an empire here, and that Peter the Great was also known for like basically his reforms and adopting Western ideas and culture from Western Europe, including attacks on basically trying to like shave their beards, and also reforms of the Orthodox Christian Church, and like basically also that they also and then like it served also like a political. It served as a capital from like 1712 until 1917, playing a crucial role in Russia's history and culture, and that the city was less renamed. It was named Petrograd because they made it because they thought like basically it was made less German until like and then that the city was devastated by the Provençal movements by the Decembrist revolt here that was back in 1825 when it was basically after like the Napoleonic Wars here that where the Russian armies are basically Decembrists are trying to take over through the Senate, but that had ultimately had failed here, and Alexander the First had ordered his men to fire at their own troops with like basically canister shots at them, and that's where the Russians had to retreat it, and like many of the Decembrists were then, but they were then eventually captured and then basically hanged and executed. And it was also basically part of like the 1905 revolution where basically protesters that came up and like after Russia's failure against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War that led to the 1905 revolution in Russia that basically where the troops fired at like basically peaceful protesters, and that's why the Russian government had basically need to sign a new constitution, and that they elected a new parliament called the Duma, which is still Russia's parliament to this day, while we're maintaining the monarchy with the absolute power and traditional authority. And also later to the Bolsheviks revolution, while Russia was losing also into the World War I, that basically Vladimir Lenin had came along here, and basically he came to St. Petersburg and like from Switzerland by a train, and basically began a speech of basically peace, land and bread, and peace to the Soviets, and like basically and many of these ideas didn't involve him, and that's why that led to the Russian Civil War, which is basically led by the communist Reds and the anti-Bolshevik Whites, and but then eventually the whites lost their support and their allies' support, and then like they were able to get the like over to capitulate the all like the whites' tactics and maneuvers, and thus the Reds won, and basically the Tsar and like his wife and children were both shot and then like executed, and like basically that like afterwards when the Bolsheviks had then stormed and overthrew the into the palace and overthrew their government and overthrow and basically elected the new government here. And it was also basically the city was also basically endured in the devastating when it was also renamed back to in the siege of Leningrad during the World War II between the Soviets and the Nazis, as well as also the Finnish army when while Russia was fighting against the Finns in the Winter Wars here, and but it was eventually then like basically resulted in a Soviet victory despite many casualties and deaths by both sides here, and it well after until after the war it was then changed back to St. Petersburg. All right, so then let's talk about William H. Crawford, who some of you guys maybe who those Guts and Blackpowder players might have saw him in the Roscoff map. He was basically those who don't know who he is. He's basically he was born back in Virginia in 1772, but then like he and his family he grew up most of his life in Georgia. He was basically also known for like basically served as like a U.S. senator. He later served as like Secretary of War under James Madison from 1815 to 1816, and the Secretary of the Treasury under President James Monroe from 1816 till 1825 here. And like that's like basically that he was in control of like the government of like basically the reforming like basically the whole army and like basically the military and like more modernization and through proven like hard and through they're trained and be well disciplined here, and also like basically the treasury like basically good control of the whole like money country's whole money profits and gold reserves and the whole economy, until he was also being successful in a bid of like a presidential bid in like the 1824 election that I mentioned in my War of 1812 video, that like he result as a result he only got like 4 electoral votes within the electoral college, and he did lead the figure in the American Republic and become a member of the Democratic Republican Party, and was known for like basically for shaping in today's U.S. politics. And then you have Gilbert Rechter Buch from Blucher, who is also basically another character. Who those of you guys might have seen him in the Kalb map. Who Blucher is beginning his military career in 1757, and he served throughout also the Napoleonic Wars, including the Battle of Leipzig and the Battle of Waterloo, where he was a field marshal. Gilbert Leibrecht von Blucher was a Prussian field marshal very known for his leadership in the Napoleonic Wars, and he did play a role in the Battle of Waterloo, and he was a key Allied victory against Napoleon and alongside who allied alongside with the Duke of Wellington. Blucher's aggressive and determined leadership earned him the nickname Marshal Forward. And then we have battleships. So you have the USS Constitution, which I mentioned also in my War of 1812, which was named nicknamed our first Ironsides here, and it was fought in many wars. It was first fought in the Quasi War between 1798 and 1800, where American ships against French privateers in the undeclared war. And second was the Barbary Wars, which was fighting against the Barbary pirates and bombarding the frigate of Philadelphia and Tripoli in August of 1804. And finally, you have the War of 1812. The ship has earned his fame after bombarding the HMS Guerriere, and as well as 4 other ships like the Java, and also capturing the Kenai and Lebanon here. That's why they gave their nickname the Old Ironsides here. And it was basically constructed to do an ship in honor basically from George Washington, and also the General of Aquino, and alongside with the establishment of ships and mills and trade here, and constructed under the British, also under the Naval Act of 1794. All right, so now, let's see. I was trying to say now we have the British brig sloop of HMS Persian of 1812. So I tried basically also research of this ship that was basically in the Copenhagen map and from the game, but this is the only ship I can find, which is the HMS Persian in 1812. But I'm gonna go over what this ship is about. The 1812 HMS Persian was known for its capture of the USS Argus in August of 1813 during the War of 1812 under Captain John Fordyce Malpley, which is an 18-gun brig sloop engage of the defeated and American brig off of St. David's Head, a significant victory for the Royal Navy, while the Pilsen bordered a capture of the Argus, which happened on August 14th of 1813. After capturing the Argus, the HMS Pilsen, which is continued its service, including the capture of the privateer Sirio and in January of 1814, and was eventually transferred to the Coast Guard in 1850, and it was sold in 1865, beginning its last in her class in service at this time. Alright, and then we have another battleship called the HMS Undaunted, who some of you guys maybe saw this in the Guts and Blackpowder game from the maps in San Sebastian and also in Vardus Fortress. The only history behind this that I can find in my research search here is that it was a 50-rated 38 mid gun that's sailing frigate of the British Royal Navy, and it was the same ship and during the Napoleonic Wars that were conveyed that it was the first exiled Napoleon back in the island in Elba in the early 1814. So and now we're going to here. So this is a quote that William H. Crawford had basically said in the game in Roscoff, which he said, "Tell me you didn't dock it. Please, you didn't. You did, didn't you? That ship would be better off floating at Trafalgar." And what he means by this quote is that Crawford is basically stating he's referring to the Battle of Trafalgar, which is launched on October the 21st of 1805, which the Battle of Trafalgar was a decisive British naval victory of a combined French and Spanish fleet on that day and year, which during the Napoleonic Wars, led by Admiral Lord Nelson, that the British fleet was used as a revolutionary tactic of attacking the 2 columns to break through the enemy lines, as well as also leading to the crushing victory despite being outnumbered. While the battle was the Royal Navy's British triumph and secured the British naval dominance, preventing the French invasion of Britain, and it was also Nelson's final battle. He mortally wounded in engagement, and Nelson was also died in the Battle of Trafalgar here, and while he was commanding his own ship, and like basically known as the HMS Victory. And while he was fighting off many of the ships, including like also like the Spanish El Trinidad, and that's why it was a destructive victory, and that's why it resulted in a victory, and that's why which was resulted in British naval dominance, and like and that's why no way that like basically Napoleon had any other attempts to go through the English Channel and to invade Great Britain. All right, and then we have the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, which is from the Leipzig map in the game, where St. Thomas Church was founded back in the 13th century in Leipzig, where the church became the center of Lutheran worship under Martin Luther preached back in 1539, making a pivotal movement of his history center of the Reformation. Because if you guys don't know who Martin Luther is, he was the guy who was against like basically the church here, who started like the Protestant Reformation, that it was basically a split between Protestants and Catholics throughout the 16th century of Europe here, and that basically their conflicts and basically wars with each other, and like basically the decline, or basically the church's reforms of the church here, and now like basically, and also like basically that they try to also basically that the Protestants also trying to side it also with the Orthodox Church by sending the Augsburg Confession back in 1575, but then the bits later then declined, and like basically that they were became separate, and it turns out they were then despised by this, but also with the under like with the Orthodox Church with under the Muscovites and they basically Russia basically conquered also their lands and neighbors here until then, like basically there were many wars and basically with the Protestants and Catholics, and Luther also basically also held with also like back in 1543, Luther was also basically like held with the Jews, like basically like the also for the Protestant Reformation here, that when the Jews like basically refused to like convert to his own forms of Christianity, he became a lot more also anti-Semitic, and like basically a book called Divide Jews and All Their Lies, and called the Jews like basically also public enemies, which and back to the Leipzig church here, where the St. Thomas Church, it was also granted international fame and become also a resting place for the 18th century German composer Johann Sebastian Bach, who is on the top here. Who served as a Kapellmeister from 1723 until his death around 1750, who was basically known for like basically his famous music and operas and composers of all the different musics and also operas and song and music he has invented. Though the rebuild and the damage by the bombing, and the church today largely has its late Gothic hall church character. And we have another church, and also in the Cow map, which is also known as St. Nicholas Church in Calb, which is a tale shared by the faith of the medieval architect originating from the 12th century tower and the church dedicated to the Holy Trinity that the Protestant parish of established in 1560, and by 1687 it becomes a dual faith church, and both Catholics and Protestants worship. In the 18th century, it was a unique building and expanded the architecturally divided between the Protestant part and the Catholic part, dedicated by Saint Nicholas. And then we have the Pfalzgrafenstein Castle in Kaub, which is the castle was basically established in between 1326 and 1327 by King Ludwig IV of Bavaria, and the castle was served as a collect river tolls from the passing traffic. It was also seeing military active, which witnessed the 39-day siege in 1504 by the War of the Succession of Landshut, which is occupied by the Spanish forces under General Spinola, for 11 years from 1620 in the 30 Years' War, and was while a brief exchange of gunfire in Kalb, Hessian forces had also attacked the besieged Gintenfels and also the castle in December of 1631 with 400 men until the Spanish capitulated in January of 1632. During the Spanish War of Succession from 1701 to 1740, 1714, the Fausengartenstein castle was used as a prison to prisoners of war. The distinctive Barqui tower the cap was added in 1714. The castle's current appearance was a result of a fire and subsequent renovation in 1756. During the Napoleonic Wars, it played also a military role, particularly in Blucher's Crossing that I mentioned from 1813 to 1814. Also, and that this part I mentioned boosts the Gunterfels castle well preserved from the town wall. And then in 1866, it was came under the Prussian control, annexation, and sale in the Seven Weeks' War, or otherwise known as like basically like the Franco-Austrian War of 1866 here, that will basically that the Prussians then defeated the Austrians had and their tolls or collections were seized in 1867, and the river has since changed significantly and made it to the wider channel safely navigable. The castle continued to be used and be a beacon of the river traffic into the 1900s, remaining in good conditions all the way to this day here. And then you have the history of the Sleepy Hollow, which is one of those secret, some of the secret maps you can find from the game. That Sleepy Hollow's history goes back from the Native American Wequassik Geek. Sorry if if I pronounce this very wrong here. I apologize, tribe. And the Dutch, who are called the Slapper Shaven, or otherwise known as the Sleepers Haven, in the 17th century. Under in the year 1639 Royal Charter, the area became part of the manor of the Philipsburg, owned by the Dutch, and the merchant Frederick Philips, who the village was incorporated as a North Terrytown in 1874 and officially renamed Sleepy Hollow in 1996. And it was largely honored of Washington Irving's 1820 short story, otherwise known as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, with the stories of it dedicating and picturing also the pumpkin like headless horseman, who was also it was also depicted as like basically a main boss fight in the from Guts and Blackpowder. And then we have also one of the unreleased or scrap maps of the game. I'll be going through this. So we have the city of London, which is the one of the next maps that are soon coming into the game, where London's history began as Roman settlement and as Londinium in 43 A.D., which grew as a key port and provincial capital of its abandonment after Roman rule collapsed in the 5th century, or like 476 A.D., when it was invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, later established under Ludwig, which is moved inside the Roman walls of the Lunenburg for defenses against the Vikings, which became a major training center. It was also conquered by the Norman conquest of 1066 under William the Conqueror, who defeated after like the English under Godfrey, who like basically after the Battle of Hastings, he basically conquered the whole of England here. And the established Westminster became a seat of government and cementing London's role as a capital, who built like basically many towns and castles, the one most notable being the Tower of London. Basically, the city was also faced the Black Death in the 14th century, and also faced the Great Fire of 1666, which had presented the extensive rebuilding of architects like Christopher Wren. The city became also a global trading center by the 18th century, and experienced a rapid growth in the 19th century. It suffered a rapid bombing raids during the Battle of Britain in 1940 during the Second World War, before it became back under its modern reconstruction. And so basically the other map here is the map of Jutland. The Jutland was a large peninsula in northern Europe that forms into the continental part of Denmark and extends into northern Germany, separating from the North and Baltic Seas. The peninsula is named after the Jutes and the Germanic people who, alongside with the Angles and Saxons, who migrated the region starting in about 450 AD and played from the part in forming Britain, and in by the 6th and 5th century, but back to the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the Jutes were also a powerful Germanic group in the area. The Danish kingdom would have been reunited under the Jutland Peninsula in 965 AD, and in 1241, Vladimir II established a Code of Jutland, creating a civil law and the code for Jutland and for other settlements. In 1915, during World War I, the German forces in the North Sea conducted raids on the British coastal towns, eventually leading to the Battle of Doggerbank, which is a location also in part of the Battle of Jutland. It was the largest naval battle of World War One here in 1916, resulting in like basically competing fought on both sides basically by the British by British warship, by both the British and like the German warships back co-located into the North Sea, eventually resulted in a British victory. All right, and then we're gonna be also going through like also some of the weapons here. So, but like basically like in the last part of the video, but like there's some weapons in Guts and Blackpowder that I try to research. Then there are some like weapons that are completely fictional, like the horse artillery pistol just simply just never existed here, or like guns that are similar, like the musket, or like I also mentioned the carbine, which I'll mention before, and also like the rifle. So I'll be going to only the real history of some of the weapons and just the guns here that I was able to research so far, starting with the musket, which the musket was a heavy shoulder firearm, replaced the arquebus involved in the early weapon in the 16th century Spain, and became a staple on the battlefields by the 17th century. The early muskets were matchlocks and replaced by the reliable flintlock mechanism in the 18th and 19th centuries, finally giving it away the percussion cap and then breech loading rifles in the mid 19th century. The muskets were also known to being used and also both in like widespread use in the American Revolutionary War, and the muskets were crucial to like colonial military success and shaped early American history. And then you have also the pistol, which in the 18th century, the flintlock pistols became standard military civilian sidearms to their reliable ease and use, faster reloading compared to the earlier matchlocks. And self-defense, the box-lock pistols were concealed triggers that were popular self-defense in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. And dueling was then the standardized of the dueling pistols and a long barrel that established around 1777. And the military and by civilian use by the early 18th century, the flintlock pistols were standard sidearms for soldiers, pirates, and civilian worldwide. And then you have the knock gun, which is the knock gun was a man-portable 7-barrel flintlock firearm that was developed in the late 18th century by the British engineer James Wilson that was manufactured by Henry Knock, designed for the Royal Navy to provide massive firepower against boarding parties to disrupt their rigging from the ship masts, and it saw service during the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars, and the gun's design was flaws, including the severe recoil potential for misfires, and ignition from risk led to the withdrawal from its service by the year 1804 and 1805. And then you have the double barrel pistol, which is the double barrel pistols were used during the 18th century, typically in the use of flintlock firearms for the personal defense, dueling, and concealment. And these pistols were featured by side or over or and under barrels and offered the advantage of second shot without a slow reload, while primarily muzzle reloaders and some designs like the late 18th century box lock pistol and screw off barrels were loaded into from the rear, and a process that was still slow and made second for shot of essential for self-defense. And then you have also another gun called the blunderbuss, which is a blunderbuss was a short muzzle loading firearm that with a large caliber flared muzzle with a early precursor of with the shotgun. It was used primarily for close range combat from the 17th to the early 19th centuries by cavalry, naval troops, and civilians like pirates and coachmen. And yeah, I think that's all that basically I can research and look and I can find for in terms of like mostly gun weapons and also like the all the research. And I think that's pretty much it of all my research here. Um, and I hope you guys basically enjoyed this video. If you guys think there's some specific evidence or like basically some details from the Guts and Blackpowder game that I might be missing here, and if so, please please feel free to share your comments down below. And yeah, but I hope you guys still enjoyed this presentation, this video. I hope you guys find this interesting. What's your guys' favorite fact that I just shared to you guys? If you find it interesting, please also be sure to comment down below. And also, if you guys want to see more history content similar to like this or so, then please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel if you're new. Don't forget to comment and hit that bell notifications. That way you get notified by every history content video that I'll be posting in the channel. So yeah, I'll see you guys in my next video. So Mr. Aaron's out. Peace.